Well, today, as you know, we are going to talk about neuroscience helping poverty policy. And I am going to dive right in. So first, we're going to just do a few definitions because why isn't this? Okay. So that we know what we're talking about when we say SES and poverty. SES is a big, complicated bundle of factors, including on the financial side, income and wealth, on sort of the social inside is, education, occupation, neighborhood characteristics, and many other factors. These are all kind of loosely correlated, not super strongly correlated, but together they define a construct that we recognize as socioeconomic status. Poverty is essentially very low SES. Strictly speaking, poverty is a monetary measure. So it's very low income. The US poverty line, just to give you a sense of where we're at in our country, it's defined by the ratio of your income, your family income to your family needs. How much money's coming in, how many mouths do you have to feed? And what? Oh, is somebody asking a question or?
Oh, yeah. No, I think someone just joined and they were briefly unmuted.
Oh, okay. So in this year, the latest stats are that 14.4% of Americans live below the poverty line. And the poverty line is a pretty, that's not a very generous level of poverty. You need, let's see, a family of 4 would be expected to live on, okay, try to come up with an answer in your mind, right? And then compare it to this. $27,750 for a family of 4 for a year. And 14.4% of Americans are making do on that or less. In terms of the relation of poverty and SES, poverty is the most harmful. But SES is, the effects of SES are more of a gradient than a threshold. So the gradient is steepest at the lowest levels, but it continues all the way up to, upper middle class, which is kind of an interesting finding. Now, why do we care about poverty and SES? Well, one reason is that it's linked to, well, all kinds of things, physical health, longevity, but also mental health and cognitive ability. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. First, this is data from Canada showing the percentage of people in a given year who have experienced symptoms that amount to a diagnosis of major depressive disorder. And it's arranged by income decile on the x-axis. So at the top is the highest 10% of earners. The bottom is the lowest 10%. And you can see that the difference in prevalence of depression from the highest to the lowest income decile is more than a factor of 2, which is a huge effect. I mean, in epidemiology, this is like a huge, huge effect. It is bigger than the gender difference in depression, which is a much studied question, and makes clear the need to better understand SES and what causes the harms of low SES. Okay. Here is a cognitive outcome. This is young adult IQ as a function of childhood family income. Family income is on the x-axis, expressed in terms of number of factors, how many minimum wage units would have to be added together to be the equivalent of the income to needs ratio that the family's living on. And as you can see, there's a healthy standard deviation, maybe more, in IQ just based on childhood family income. So, can everybody see the full screen here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you, because I'm getting a little bit of, okay. It's a little cut off for me. Okay, so clearly this means that SES is linked to the brain because intelligence and emotional well-being are functions of the brain. Therefore, we are going to cover a little bit of the science, exploring the relation between SES and the brain. And then we're going to focus on the policy implications. Okay, 1 and 2. So I'm going to start with a little science, and maybe the more honest way to describe it is a hopelessly incomplete, sketchy, inadequate summary of the science. Nevertheless, here we go. First of all, we know that there are structural and functional correlates of SES in the brain. That is, there are differences, subtle differences to be sure, but they're there. In the volume of different brain structures, surface area thickness of cortex, also in the functional correlates, that is the pattern and magnitude of activation while people perform tasks. So there is a there. There are neural correlates of SES. Furthermore, these neural correlates are predictive of psychological outcomes. Now, that's important, I think, because we're hoping neuroscience can enhance our policy solutions, but not because we want people's brains to be better, right? We want people to have better lives. We want people to have more capabilities, to be happier, to be healthier, etc. The brain is a means to an end there. And so I think it's very important to note that, yes, we have this nice collection of brain findings, but they also have relevance to the psychological outcomes. They mediate them. We have a still very rudimentary understanding of the causal pathways through which SES impacts the brain. But we're getting there little by little. It'll be a long time till that topic is completed. But that's a very important issue that we should not neglect. Why is this happening? And let me just note, there's a lot more to say. SES manifests differently at different points in the lifespan. There are what are called sensitive periods, that is, different phases of life when the brain is more or less sensitive to the effects of the environment. There are genetic effects, which is a vexed topic, but seem to exist for SES. And as far as the science goes, there are, all of the replicability, robustness problems that our field, that neuroscience, as well as psychology and basic cancer biology and lots of other fields, have been grappling with. You can't assume when you see a finding that it is replicable. You hope it is. As people use better and better research practices, it is more and more the case, but there's plenty to grapple with there. Okay, so now let's look at the policy implications. I think, well, the question is, are there any? Does any of the stuff that I kind of gestured toward just now tell us anything about what we should do as a society to improve the lot of low SES people. And I'm gonna kind of caricature things a bit and say, well, there's two camps. There are the neuro enthusiasts who say, this is great. Now, something they sometimes say is we can lift up the hood and look inside and see what's really going on, which is a weird metaphor that doesn't really correspond to anything that I think neuroscience lets you do, but it's very compelling for sure. And there's neuroskepticism, which is the idea of, like, yeah, you keep saying how great neuroscience is. What's it done? What's it going to do anytime soon? You're just being naive. Okay, so let me just go through each of those. Neuropolicy enthusiasm. This is, I'm going to give you all examples relative to poverty. Okay, so this is a book, very a good-selling book on Amazon in the education section, uses, what does being poor do to kids' brains, uses a lot of neuroscience. It doesn't really establish any relevant connections, but
Neuropolicy.
Hi, somebody needs to mute their microphone. Okay. Here's another publication, actually from the NEA, which is like a very responsible organization. They do list some findings about the neuroscience of poverty and children. Doesn't really have doesn't have any sort of action items following from it. And now I'm going to just kind of zoom through. This is a sort of a way of framing the need for society to attend to children in, kind of wrapped in the cloak of neuroscience, totally worthy project. Here's another worthy project from the UK, making heavy use of brain imaging. This is a poverty reduction program in Boston for adult women. And I don't know if you can see, but the impacts of these conditions on brain development, applying brain science to social policy. Well, basically, when you look at these things, I will say you find invariably well-intentioned authors, policymakers, who really have, in every case, failed to find any actionable idea in neuroscience. They find good actionable ideas in other areas, including psychology, but the neuroscience is kind of superfluous so far. So now what about the skeptics? Again, in relation to poverty, a long time ago, Arthur Jensen wrote this, sort of bombshell review that basically said, look, there's nothing you can do in the environment, including interventions, to raise the intelligence of low SES kids. And more recently, a current thinker, Steve Pinker, complains that people are not, when they look at the brain poverty work, they immediately assume that it's an environmental effect. But, harking back to Jensen, it could be genetic. It could be unsusceptible to the environment. He says people might inherit genes that made their parents bigger brained, hence smarter, hence richer. You can't deny it's a possibility. It's an empirical question, and we need to find out the empirical answer. Most recently, Charles Murray, very famous for, well, let me just say he wrote a book in which he says class structure essentially SES, is importantly based on differences in abilities that have a substantial genetic component. Therefore, interventions are inherently constrained on the effects they can have. So basically, these neuropolicy skeptics are saying, look, just because the kids' brains show differences doesn't mean there's anything you can do by policy change, for example, better education, interventions, nutrition, et cetera, that is going to change that. Okay, finally, probably, I have to hand it to her, the sort of clearest statement of the challenge to neuropolicy in the domain of poverty comes from Amy Wax of the Penn Law School. This is work that she did, quite a while ago, 5 years ago. And I pulled out 2 quotes here, which I think nicely encapsulate sort of the key issues that it's on us who want to use neuroscience to reduce the harms of poverty. It's on us to show why these arguments don't hold water, that they don't ultimately carry the day. So the first idea is that, again, going back to Jensen and Pinker and Charles Murray, we can't discriminate between innate versus environmental causes for the psychological differences or the brain differences. So you cannot predict that environmental interventions will be helpful. Well, this is an empirical issue, right? So let's look at the data. Innate versus environmental. Does it even matter? I'm going to give you a solid yes and no, like a good academic. Yes, if the harms of poverty are not caused by the environment, but are instead some genetic inheritance, then it's not so clear what to change to ameliorate the person's problems. However, a big no, which I think trumps that yes, because even though, were the harms caused by the environment, then one thing you could for sure say is correcting the environment would reverse the harms. Just because the harms are not environmentally caused, perhaps they are innate, they can be mitigated too. When a child shows up at CHOP with PKU or hemophilia, both of which are genetic diseases, the doctors don't say, well, go home, this is genetic, so there's nothing we can do. There's no environmental intervention like medicine or dietary changes or anything that we can give you, right? Of course not. It doesn't really matter what the origin of a problem is. Typically, there are environmental solutions which society could be called upon to provide. Even so, we don't have to, capitulate that it's all genetic. I mean, this is saying basically, even if it were all genetic, it wouldn't mean policy is useless. It wouldn't mean interventions are useless. But in fact, there is plenty of evidence of environmental causation for the psychological disparities between low and high SES people, and also for the neural ones. And I'm going to just flag a few of these here. So this is a study that I did with a group of colleagues at Virginia Tech, and also my colleague, Saul Sternberg, who is a member of the psychology department here. We examined subjects, 40-year-old subjects, who had been, starting in the 1970s, in an early enrichment, early cognitive enrichment study. We had the enrichment kids who got intensive cognitive and linguistic stimulation, and we had the control kids who actually got enhanced nutrition and healthcare. So they actually thought they were in an intervention as well. They thought they were the experimental group. And so the question is, does an environmental intervention like, excellent intensive cognitive and linguistic stimulation, which characterizes the childhoods of higher SES kids relative to lower, is that enough to result in detectable brain differences? So now I can explain what these bar charts are. The bar charts basically say yes, more so for male subjects than for females, but at least in, that's the, I think it's the left inferior frontal gyrus here. In most areas examined in the males, the volume of cortex was larger as a result of participating in the intervention. And furthermore, that was a lasting effect 35 years later. So that's one demonstration that these differences are unlikely to be all innate. Here's another beautiful study, not done by myself, but by a group led by Jean Brody. It's an intervention in young teens aimed at reducing stress. And of course, we know that stress is a big feature of low SES environment. The control subjects, closed circles, the more years they lived in poverty, the smaller their amygdala became, and other parts of the brain as well, hippocampal regions. Whereas kids in the intervention, the Strong African American Families program, were inoculated from these effects of poverty. They spent equally long in poverty as the control kids, but it did not shrink their amygdala. So again, these are environmental effects on the brain as a function of poverty. Okay. Finally, this is a study that I did recently with some colleagues, Gidi Nave here at Penn, and various colleagues in Amsterdam mostly. We analyzed roughly 30,000 MRI scans in the UK Biobank as a function of SES. And what we found is if we just looked at the areas whose volume correlates with SES, we find a bunch of areas, as you can see in the bright colors. If we look at the genetic risk score, the polygenic score for SES, and correlate that with the same brain scans, we see very similar areas cropping up, which means, yeah, at least some of this effect of SES is genetically driven. But interestingly, if you look at the difference, this is what can be accounted for by genetics versus what cannot. There remain highly significant differences in brain volume associated with SES. So again, conclusion, it's not just genetic, it's not just innate, there's an environmental influence. So that is my attempt to, essentially dispense with this critique. We know that it's not environmental. We know that it's not purely genetic. Even if it were, it doesn't mean you can't create effective interventions. Now let's look here, because I think this is an important point. The claim is neuroscience yields no special insights over and above behavioral science into how to eliminate harms. So in other words, just to put words in her mouth, but I'm guessing she would agree, you're just sort of decorating plain old insights from behavioral science with some pretty neuroscience decorations. Neuroscience is the bright, shiny new thing. Everybody needs some in their work to feel good, to feel like they're doing snazzy stuff. And that's the only role that neuroscience can play in efforts to reduce the harms of poverty. So let's look at that. Okay, so what is being asked for here is the unique contribution, the special insight into the causes of these terrible disadvantages for people in poverty. But is that the right standard? Is that the criterion? Do we find something useful about a research finding for the sake of poverty only if it's, wow, something new? We never thought about that before. Well, no, in fact, policy is typically based on the weight of evidence. If it's a singular snazzy finding of the kind that puts you on the cover of Science, you're not really going to rush out and incorporate it into your policy recommendations, right? Rather, it's the weight of evidence. So, for example, psychological research has already shown that stress is higher in poor families. And, you might say, well, do you need a neuroscientist to tell you that stress is high and it's bad for kids? Well, you don't need a neuroscientist to tell you that. But if you have a second strong source of evidence that that's true, that is absolutely going to increase your willingness to be guided in the formulation of policy by the idea of stress. And that's what we're doing here. So, it's really interesting. Academics, we all think if it's good, it means it's new, unprecedented. Well, that's what gets you on the cover of Science, but it's not what gives you useful policy. Okay. So what is the potential to deliver actionable information from neuroscience? Is it all just, adding a little more weight to the yes, stress is bad column, or are there some more specifically actionable items? And because I cannot see my presenter view, I just want to, okay. I am going to walk through some near-term, not too insane, medium-term, possible policy actions that could be taken on the basis of neuroscience. And I welcome your opinions on whether these are kind of crazy sci-fi or, realistic, worth doing some translational research on. Okay, first of all, my former student, Kim Noble, wrote a wonderful article a few years ago about the use of brain-based biomarkers in poverty research, but policy as well. You can extend that. What is a biomarker? It's some biological measure that correlates with a condition and correlates and or is predictive of it. And in the case of poverty, there will be, as we've already observed, brain differences. as well, brain structure differences, function, et cetera, neurohormonal, that can indicate either particularly vulnerable kids or general trends. Certain neighborhoods, are suffering more than others from deprivation. I certainly don't see this being used next month, but I do think that biomarkers can be used for not just research, but also screening and prediction. And that is especially important early in life, because, we can take somebody who's 12 years old and sit them down and say, fill out this questionnaire, answer these questions, perform this little reaction time task, and get a picture of how they're doing. But you can't do that with a 6-month-old, or really, you can't really do it with a 2-year-old. That is where these biomarkers are extremely useful and offer something unique. So, we know something about the EEG patterns that are associated with later success or failure in school, for example. Well, if we follow the trajectory of the development of these EEG patterns, we will have, working backwards, a biomarker that will help us anticipate cognitive delays, problems, need for additional help. Okay, and again, at a time when the kid cannot perform a task for you. I think a really interesting policy implication, maybe the one that's closest to being actionable, is revealing windows of opportunity for protecting brain development. There's some very interesting work now being done on fetal brain structure and brain function, fetal fMRI, and relating it to postnatally psychological adjustment, and prenatally the kinds of stresses that change these prenatal brain signals. We know that maternal stress, for example, does have a negative effect on the development of the fetus's brain, and that to the longest length that's been followed up, which I think is maybe just a few years, it does seem to be predictive of problems. Okay, so in a perfect world, we would make sure that at no point in a person's life, from prenatal to old age, are they dealing with stress from insufficient resources. But we can't do that. But maybe we could get it together to protect a pregnant mother for the months of her pregnancy. These stress relations, they also synergize with environmental toxins. So, okay, let's help with stress. Let's put, air filters in the apartment, and so forth. This would give us maximum bang for buck, and I think that is probably an asset in terms of implementing new policies. Finally, a topic I've been working on with Lynn Hu here at the Penn GSE is qualitative differences in brain function with SES. So it is the case, I wouldn't say most of the time, but I would say some of the time, that lower and higher SES kids perform cognitive tasks differently using different brain systems. The best worked out case of this is in mathematical thinking, where the higher SES kids use a verbal strategy. And in fact, the better they do on the math problems, the more they light up their verbal regions of the brain. But there's no such systematic relationship with their spatial areas and parietal cortex. In contrast, for the low SES kids, the better they do, the more they light up their posterior parietal lobe spatial processes, consistent with them using a spatial, not a verbal strategy. And they show no systematic relation between performance and verbal area activation. So that's pretty strong evidence that came to us through brain imaging. And it's all about different patterns inside that you wouldn't notice if you're just testing kids behaviorally. That shows that the lower SES kids are not just doing worse in math, which on average they do, but even when you equate performance, their performance is dependent on different parts of the brain, different systems with very different systems of representation. I mean, wow. So that means if you want to design interventions, you better think about who you're intervening with. If it's a high SES community and you're doing remedial math, you know, the intervention that works with the low SES kids may not work with the higher SES kids because they've grown up, they've developed using a different method. So again, that's actionable, and we wouldn't know it other than for neuroscience. Farther out in time, and perhaps in, you know, sci-fi-ness, manipulations of epigenetics. I mean, there are ways to do that. I don't know if it's done or advisable to be done in humans, but you know, blue sky. Critical periods, there are scientists, including some of the people that Alison Mackey is working with, who are developing ways to manipulate critical periods so that they can bring back plasticity to give kids essentially another shot at learning essential skills and knowledge. And then finally, this is where my screen is cut off. So let me just see.
It says microbiome.
Thank you. Okay, yes, and this is like the weird, perhaps idea. I assume you all have heard something about the microbiome craze, and in particular, the idea that the microorganisms in your gut play an important role in communicating with the brain. They receive messages from the brain and they send messages from the brain, and are therefore and do play a substantial role in physical and mental health. There are even studies exploring the possibility of treating the microbiome. Obviously, you know, probiotics is one way, fecal transplants is another. And we know that the microbiome varies as a function of SES. Probably not surprising because the environments in which people live are different and their diets are different. The microbiome, you know, shifts according to what you're feeding it. But the possibility of doing this, you know, very seemingly unrelated, almost comic and gross intervention, it could be helpful. So I'm just tossing out, you know, not that I think any of these things is going to be used or be successful in the next 5 years. But these are possibilities that are not, I will say that we cannot a priori rule them out. And they are suggested by neuroscience research, not any other source of research. So in conclusion, the neuroscience of SES is a young science. I mean, basically, you could not find a paper on this in the year 2000. And the literature has been exploding. You know, we have to be patient. If you think of how long people have been studying the neuroscience of autism or the neuroscience of depression or schizophrenia, it's a long, long time, way longer than the neuroscience of SES. And we persist because it seems clear that there is the potential for translation into clinical problem solving. Here, the question is, you know, are we being unrealistic to sort of say, hey, neuroscience, you know, what have you done for poverty policy lately? Because, you know, it takes a long time for a field to develop at a scientific level and begin to be applied and tested in more policy-related form. So here for a long game, proceed with patience, and you know, don't listen to people who have this naive idea of how quickly science gets translated into practical use. Whoops. Okay. Oh, come on. I know there's more bullets. Okay. Oh, this is something that I took out of the talk. Didn't take it out of my conclusion slide, sorry. I want to say that there is some overreach, and it's well-meaning. So I don't think we should, you know, make fun of people about this, but it is overreach, and it really doesn't do the field of neuroscience policy and SES neuroscience any favors to have people saying just kind of vague, fatuous things. There has also been skeptical backlash against it. Again, you know, there's a grain of truth in these criticisms, but I think they do overstate the case. And I want to say that it has already made modest contributions, and there is lots of future potential. And I thank you.